Týden vědy a techniky.
Největší vědecký festival v České republice.
Přednášky, dny otevřených dveří, výstavy, vědecké kavárny, promítání filmů, exkurze, technické vynálezy.
Již v listopadu.
Týden vědy a techniky.
Dobrý večer, vážené dámy, vážené pánové. Dovolte, abych se představil. Jmenuji se Manfred Weinberg a jsem profesorem německé literatury na germanistice v Praze. Vítám vás na druhé prezentaci našeho přednáškového cyklu s názvem Prager Lektüren, Prague Readings, Lectiones Pragensis, Pražská čtení, kterou bude požádat Ústav germánských studií Filozofické fakulty Karlovy univerzity každý podzim. V jejím rámci se budou konat přednášky a semináře mezinárodně proslulých kulturologů. Obzvláště mě těší, I'm a little bit tired, že pozvání přijali ve světě uznávaní paní profesorka, doktorka Aleida Assmannová a pan Professor Dr. Jan Assmann. Guten Abend, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren. Ich darf Sie sehr herzlich zum zweiten Vortrag unserer Reihe unter dem Titel Prager Lektüren begrüßen, der Lehrstuhl für germanische Studien an der Philosophischen Fakultät der Karls-Universität von nun an jeden Herbst anbieten wird. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you to the second lecture of our new series titled Prague Readings, which the Department of German Studies at the Philosophical Faculty of Charles University in Prague will offer from now on every autumn. In this framework, will be held lectures and seminars by internationally recognized cultural scientists. I'm extremely pleased that we succeeded to open this series with two very influential scholars of literary and cultural studies with a worldwide reputation, Professor Dr. Aleida Assmann and Professor Dr. Jan Assmann. Aleida and Jan Assmann have actually established a whole new research area with their studies about cultural memory, which are increasingly noticed even in the cultural sciences here in Czech Republic. This year's Prague Readings was opened yesterday in the evening with a presentation of Jan Assmann titled Exodus, History and Memory. Today, two seminars on text by Aleida and Jan Assmann was held with great success. And now we are looking forward to the public talk, to the talk of Aleida Assmann under the title From Collective Violence to a Common Future, 4 Models for Dealing with a Traumatic Past. Well, the talk of Jan Assmann yesterday took place in cooperation with of our Department of German Studies with the Prague Center for Jewish Studies. Aleida Assmann's talk tonight is organized in cooperation of Ústav germánských studií with the Institute of the Czech Literature of the Academy of Science of the Czech Republic. We are thankful that this lecture can take place here in this large hall of the Czech Academy of Science. Before I'm giving the floor to Alexander Kratochvil, Dr. Alexander Kratochvil, as representative of the Czech Academy of Science, I first have to thank the University of Constance and the Ministry of Education, Baden-Württemberg, Germany, because the series Prague Readings is co-financed this year and will be co-financed in the next years by these institutions. Thank you for your attention, and now, Alexander, it's your turn.
Yeah, thank you, Manfred. Good evening, and let me welcome to the lecture of Professor Aleida Assmann. As Manfred Weinberg mentioned, the lecture is organized by the Institute of Czech Literature in cooperation with the Department of German Studies at Charles University and generously supported by the Week of Science and Technology of the Czech Academy of Science. Thank you for that support. I want to thank Professor Assmann for coming to Prague. And before we will start with your lecture, From Collective Violence to a Common Future, 4 models for dealing with a traumatic past. Let me say a few introductory words. Today's lecturer, Aleida Assmann, is professor for English literature and literary theory at the University of Constance. She has taught as a guest professor at different universities abroad, for example, Princeton, Yale, Chicago, Vienna, and she was awarded with a honorary doctorate of the University of Oslo, with the Max Planck Research Award, and with Paul Watzlawick Ehrenring, and 2011 with Ernst Robert Curtius Prize in Essay Writing. Her research interests include the history and theory of reading and writing, cultural concepts of time, and historical anthropology. The study of memory as an individual, collective, and cultural phenomenon, including literary representations of trauma, is a central and ongoing focus in her research. Recent publications on memory theory and adoptions of that theory include a collaborative book with Geoffrey Hartman, The Future of Memory and the Holocaust, then Cultural Memory in Western Civilization, Memory in a Global Age, and then I could go on with other milestones and memory research, but one book I want to mention especially. It's so come in. Yeah, it's the well-known Erinnerungsräume, Formen und Wandlungen im kulturellen Gedächtnis. The English title is Cultural Memory and Western Civilization. The translation of that book is part of our research program on cultural memory and trauma at the Institute for Czech Literature of the Czech Academy of Science. This research focus on cultural memory includes different activities at the Institute for Czech Literature, and one of them is a series of lectures from autumn 2012 to summer 2013, dedicated to various topics of cultural memory and trauma in literature and movies of Central and Eastern Europe. And so we are very glad, yes, even proud, to have one of the leading scholars on memory studies as today's lecturer, Professor Assmann. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much for these very kind words of introduction. We already had an animate conversation today. We had many events today. One yesterday, it was really a busy but very engaged meeting here for us in Prague, and I'm very happy to see that the relationship between our universities, Constance and Prague, is becoming closer and closer every day almost. I'm very happy to meet Professor Weinberg again, with whom I have taught for some time at Constance, and also Dr. Kratochwil, whom I also know from Constance. So it's a pleasure for me to be back in Prague and to now be honored with this task to launch this new series having to do with memory, trauma, and literature. My paper will not exactly deal with literature, but I hope I can make some contribution to your general topic, because trauma will be part of my paper. It will be mainly directed at the question how to deal with trauma in the aftermath, how to come to terms with historic trauma, and how perhaps also how to overcome it. The Israeli philosopher Avishai Margalit dedicated his book, The Ethics of Memory, to his parents, whom he introduced to the reader on the second page already of his preface. From my childhood, he writes, I witnessed an ongoing discussion between my parents about memory. Margalit then reconstructs this parental dialogue, which started after the Second World War, when it became obvious that both of their huge families in Europe had been destroyed. This is what the mother used to say. The Jews were irretrievably destroyed. What is left is just a pitiful remnant of the great Jewish people, by which she meant European Jewry. The only honorable role for the Jews that remains is to form communities of memory, to serve as soul candles like the candles that are ritually kindled in memory of the dead. And this is what the father used to reply. We, the remaining Jews, are people, not candles. It is a horrible prospect for anyone to live just for the sake of retaining the memory of the dead. That is what the Armenians opted to do, and they made a terrible mistake. We should avoid it at all costs. Better to create a community that thinks predominantly about the future and reacts to the present, not a community that is governed from mass graves. Now, after 1945, it was first the father's position that prevailed, and not only in Israel. What mattered then in Israel was the collective project of founding a new state, of forging a new beginning for survivors and opening up the future for successive generations. 4 decades later, during the 1980s, the mother's position became more and more dominant. The survivors turned to the past that they had held at a distance for long. After the foundation of the state had been politically accomplished and confirmed by 2 more wars, Yad Vashem became the symbolic cultural center of the nation, and Israeli society transformed itself more and more into a ritualistic community of memory. Margalit has presented 2 paradigmatic solutions for the problem of dealing with the traumatic past: remembering or forgetting. Either preservation of the past or orientation towards the future. Now, I want to argue that today we are no longer dealing only with these 2 mutually exclusive models, but are experimenting right now with 3 or perhaps even 4 models. I will refer to them as follows. I will talk about dialogic forgetting, then go on to the model which I call remembering in order to never forget. The next one, remembering in order to overcome. And the last one, dialogic remembering. All these 4 models are attempts at overcoming a traumatic history of violence. They all aim at diffusing the pernicious fuel of violence, be it through an oppressive regime of silence on the part of the victors, be it through the fuel of resentment and hatred on the part of the losers. One of the lessons of the First World War was that asymmetric memories and silences prepare the ground for further violence. All of the following models respond to traumatic violence by negotiating mutual strategies of memory and visions of the past. They were implemented after the Second World War and developed in response to new outbreaks of autocratic and genocidal violence. Holocaust in the first place, but also Latin American dictatorships, South African apartheid, the Balkan War, Rwanda. As well as in response to the lasting impact of older genocides and crimes against humanity, and here we can also include European colonialism and slavery. I start now with my first model, which I call dialogic forgetting. During the 1990s, we saw the coining of the innovative term culture of remembrance, Erinnerungskultur, a term which provides a cultural framework within which we automatically assume that remembering is a beneficial obligation which we must fulfill. Remembering thus appears as a significant social and cultural resource. This picture has been thoroughly upset recently by Christian Meyer, historian, German historian, whose latest book, Das Gebot zu vergessen und die Unabweisbarkeit des Erinnerns, The Imperative to Forget and the Inescapability of Remembering, posits a theory that it is the ability to forget which must be considered the cultural achievement. Remembering is only to be recommended under one absolutely exceptional circumstance, which is Auschwitz. In all cases, we should forget. Meyer argues as a historian, drawing attention to forgetting as an age-old strategy of containing the explosive force of conflictual memories. Forgetting was introduced, for instance, as he points out and reminds us, in ancient Greece after civil wars in order to achieve closure after a period of internal violence and to mark a new era in which a divided society could grow together again. Of course, the state could not directly influence the memories of its citizens, but it could prohibit the public articulation of resentments that were liable to reactivate old hatred and new violence. After the Peloponnesian War, for instance, an Athenian law ordered such a form of stipulated forgetting. The injunction to forget was legally enforced by restricting public communication through specific taboos. A new word was even coined to describe what was henceforth forbidden. Mnesikakein, which means literally the injunction not to remember what is bad, the bad that others have inflicted upon you. You're not supposed to remember that, because it raises resentment and hatred and refuels violence. The same model was implemented, by the way, after other civil wars. For instance, after the 30 Years' War. The 1948 peace treaty of Münster and Osnabrück contains the formula perpetua oblivio et amnestia, perpetual forgetting and amnesty. This policy of forgetting often goes hand in hand with a blanket amnesty in order to end mutual hatred and achieve a new social integration of formerly opposed parties. Now, it is interesting to note, and maybe you wouldn't think that this was possible from thinking from today backwards, it is interesting to note that even after 1945, the model of dialogic forgetting was still widely used as a political tool. The International Court of Nuremberg trials had, of course, dispensed traditional justice by indicting major Nazi functionaries for the newly defined crime against humanity. This, however, was an act of purging, I would call it, rather than remembering the past. In post-war Germany, the public sphere and that of official diplomacy remained largely shaped by what was called a pact of silence. The term was introduced in 1983, by the way, at a commemoration event after 50 years of the pogrom of Nazi Germany against Jews in November 9, 1938. So 50 years later, at a conference, Hermann Lübbe introduced this term of a pact of silence. He called it kommunikatives Beschweigen. He made the controversial point that maintaining silence was a necessary pragmatic strategy adopted in post-war Germany and also supported by the Allies to facilitate the economic and political reconstruction of the state and the integration of society. These goals were swiftly achieved in West Germany at the price of putting the former NS elites back into power. Dialogic forgetting, or the Pact of Silence, became also a strategy of European politics. It was widely adopted during the period of the Cold War, in which much had to be forgotten in order to consolidate the new Western military alliance against that of the communist bloc. As an example, we may refer to a speech that Winston Churchill gave in Zurich in 1946. From the vantage point of the newly constituted House of Europe, he was looking back on the Second World War as a civil war, which he hoped could be overcome by the tried and tested means of forgetting. After those most responsible had been condemned in Nuremberg, Churchill demanded an end, as he said, to the process of reckoning, declaring that we must all turn our backs upon the horrors of the past. We must look to the future. We cannot afford to drag forward across the years that are to come the hatreds and revenges which have sprung from the injuries of the past. If Europe is to be saved from infinite misery and indeed from final doom, there must be an act of faith in the European family and an act of oblivion against all the crimes and follies of the past. It is important to note that forgetting at that time was not equivalent to suppressing memory. A moralistic or therapeutic discourse was not yet developed in Germany until the 1960s. In the 1940s and 50s, forgetting was associated with a spirit of renewal and of opening up the future. The general hope in the regenerative power of the future was a central value of modernism shared by European countries in both East and West. Especially after civil wars, forgetting was prescribed as a potent remedy against socially dangerous and explosive forms of remembering to foster a speedy integration. Dialogic silence was a remedy, but it was clearly no general cure for other situations to dispose of a traumatic past. The Pact of Forgetting works only after mutual forms of violence between combatants or under the pressure of a new military alliance like the NATO. It cannot work after situations of asymmetric relations in which all-powerful perpetrators attack defenseless victims. The paradigmatic case of such an asymmetric situation of extreme violence is the Nazi genocide of European Jewry. The paradigmatic shift from the model of forgetting to an orientation towards remembering occurred with the return of the Holocaust memory after a period of latency. And there are different stages. We can say this memory returned in various steps. In the 1960s, it re-emerged together with the images of the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, which were projected into a transnational public arena. This televised event transformed the silenced memories of Israeli and diasporic Jewish families into a new ethnic community of memory. After the broadcasting of the American television series Holocaust in 1978, the impact of this event spilled over to those who had no share in the historical experience, but joined the memory community on the basis of empathy. In the 1980s and 90s, a number of events happened in Germany that transformed the social consensus that made the nation of the former perpetrators ready to formally join the transnational Holocaust community of memory. After 2000, this memory community was further extended when it was officially taken up by other European states and the United Nations. This general turn from amnesia to anamnesis could be witnessed in Germany and the respective countries on all levels of personal and collective remembering. It was supported by books and films, public debates and exhibitions, museums, monuments, and acts of commemoration on a social, national, and transnational level. Holocaust memory today is supported by an extended community with a long-term commitment. This memory is sealed with a special pledge for an indefinite future, to remember in order to never forget. This is the pledge. Through its widening in space as well as time, it has acquired the quality of a kind of civil religion. In the case of the Holocaust, the model of dialogic forgetting as a strategy of sealing a traumatic past and opening up a new future was no longer considered a viable solution for the problem. On the contrary, this form of closure was exactly what had to be prevented now by all means. Remembering was the only adequate response to such collectively destructive and devastating experiences. It was rediscovered not only as a therapeutic remedy for the survivors, but also as a spiritual and ethical obligation for the millions of dead victims. Thus, slowly but inevitably, the pact of forgetting was transformed into an ethical pact of remembering. The aim of such a pact is to transform the asymmetric experience of violence into shared forms of remembering. Transformation of asymmetric experience of violence into shared forms of remembering. To leave the memory of suffering to the afflicted victim group was now recognized as prolonging the original murderous constellation. The fatal polarity between perpetrator and victim could never be reconciled, but it could be overcome by a shared memory based on an empathetic and ethical recognition of the victim's memories. The establishing of such a pact of remembering between the Germans and the successors, as the successors of the perpetrators, and the Jews as the successors of the victims, was a historically new and unique answer to the historically unprecedented crime of the Holocaust. I come to my third model, which I call remembering in order to overcome. The cumulative process of returning Holocaust memory was a decisive event in the 1980s that brought about a profound change in sensibility also in other places of the world in dealing with historic traumas. Against this background of a new awareness of the suffering of victims, forgetting was no longer acceptable as a general policy in overcoming atrocities of the past. Remembering became a universal ethical and political claim when dealing with other historic traumas, such as the dictatorships in South America, the South African regime of apartheid, colonial history, or the crime of slavery. In most of these discourses about other atrocities, references to and metaphorical allusions were made to the newly established memory icon of the Holocaust. I want to argue, however, that although the Holocaust quickly became the prototype of traumatic memories and was and is regularly invoked in the rhetoric of memory activists all over the world, it was not chosen as a model. The transformation of traumatic suffering into a semi-religious, transnational and perpetual memory of a normative past, and here I pick up the term that Jan Assmann introduced yesterday for the Exodus memory, the memory of a normative past. Such a transnational perpetual memory of a normative past is not what was and is aimed at in other contexts. Remembering in the context of the third model, which I want to introduce here, took on another quality. One that did not anxiously exclude, but also included, to a certain extent, certain forms of forgetting. Since the 1980s and 90s, we have witnessed a new policy of memory that is no longer in strict opposition to forgetting, but somehow also in alliance with it. In this model, the aim is also, in some sense, forgetting, but the way to achieve this aim is paradoxically leads through remembering. In this case, remembering is not implemented to memorialize an event of the past into an indefinite future, but is introduced as a therapeutic tool to cleanse, to purge, to heal, to reconcile. It is not pursued as an end in itself, but as a means to an end, which is the forging of a new beginning. Whenever the term reconciliation comes up in the Holocaust discourse, it is immediately refuted as a highly problematic term. In clear opposition to this, the contested term has become the central keyword in the context of the third model, namely reconciliation. Reconciliation is often proverbially connected to the two verbs to forgive and forget. Forgive and forget. The third model, however, clearly deviates from this common sense model of reconciliation, forgive and forget. It decouples the two actions of forgiving and forgetting and connects in a new way forgiving to remembering. Remembering here means recognition of the victim's memories. Without a clear facing and working through the atrocities of the past from the point of view of those who suffered, the process of social, national, or transnational reconciliation cannot begin. In this context, remembering is the beginning of a process, but not necessarily its end. Cultures in history have produced ample evidence for such forms of transitory, we could also call it, and transitional remembering. In the ritual framework of Christian confession, for instance, remembering is means the introduction of, the first act of a drama which ends with forgetting. The sins have to be publicly articulated and listed before they can be blotted out through the absolution of the priest. A similar logic is at work in the artistic concept of catharsis. Through the representation of a painful event on stage, a traumatic past can be once more collectively relived and overcome in the very process of doing so. According to the theory of Aristotle, the group that undergoes such a process is purged in this shared experience. Forgetting, however, through remembering, is at bottom also the goal of Freudian psychotherapy. A painful past has to be raised onto the level of language and consciousness in order to be able to move forward and leave it behind. To remember in order to forget holds also true for witnessing at court, where the sole function of the witness is to support with his or her testimony the legal procedure of finding the truth and reaching a verdict. As the goal of every trial is the verdict and conclusion of the procedure, its aim is closure and therewith the final erasure of the event from social memory. There is a world of a difference between the legal witness testifying to a crime within the institution of the court, on the one hand, and the so-called moral witness, to use Avishai Margalit's term, testifying to a crime against humanity publicly outside the courtroom before a moral community. While the former's narrative is subordinated to the legal process, the testimony of the latter is part of a civic culture of remembrance. A merging of the legal and therapeutic function was aimed at in the staging of remembering in South Africa. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as designed by Bishop Tutu and Alex Borain, created a new form of public ritual which combined features of the tribunal, the cathartic drama, and the Christian confession. In these public rituals, a traumatic event had to be publicly narrated and shared. The victim had to tell his or her experiences, and they had to be witnessed and acknowledged by the accused before they could be relegated to the shared past. The model of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, was invented not in South Africa but in South America, when countries such as Chile, Uruguay, Argentina, and Brazil transitioned, as the term is, from military dictatorships to democracies in the 1980s and 90s. By enforcing the moral human rights paradigm, new political and extremely influential concepts were coined, such as human rights violations and state terrorism. This led to the establishment of investigative commissions, which became the antecedent of later truth commissions. They emphasized the transformative value of truth and stressed the importance of acts of remembrance. Remember so as not to repeat began to emerge as a message and as a cultural imperative. Nunc amas. Within the human rights framework, a new and highly influential concept of victimhood was now constructed. It replaced the older frameworks within which power struggles used to be debated in terms of class struggles, national revolutions, and political antagonisms. By resorting to the universal value of bodily integrity and human rights, the new terminology depoliticized to some extent the conflict, because it led away from traditional ideologies, depoliticized the conflict, and led to the elaboration of memory policies. In the new framework of a human rights agenda and a new memory culture, also other forms of state violence could be addressed, such as racial and gender discrimination, repression, and the rights of indigenous people. When decades and sometimes centuries after a traumatic past, justice in the full sense is no longer possible, memory was discovered as an important symbolic resource to retrospectively acknowledge these crimes against humanity. What the transnational movement of abolition was for the 19th century, the new transnational concept of victimhood is for the late 19th and early 20th century. And the late 20th and early 21st century, The important change is, however, that now the victims speak for themselves as opposed to abolition movement and claim their memories in a globalized public arena. The dissemination of their voices and their public visibility and audibility has created a new world ethos that is not automatically enforced, but makes it increasingly difficult for state authorities to continue a repressive policy of forgetting and silence. Now, a new response to the disenfranchised discourse of human rights and mutual global media observation is the memory policy of public apology. We are, without doubt, writes Christopher Dase, living in an age of political apologies. The Pope apologizes for the Inquisition, the United Nations apologize for their inactiveness during the genocide in Rwanda, the Queen apologizes for the repression of the Maori in New Zealand, President Jacques Chirac for the Dreyfus affair, and President Bill Clinton for the slave trade. But this is just a tiny little part of the list. It could go really on for another hour. The list, as I said, can go on. Whatever we may think of these acts, they are evidence of new departures in the construction of nations as moral communities in the contemporary world of media observation. Democratic states and their societies distinguish themselves from others in taking the principles of care and public accountability seriously. This involves a new memory policy and culture of remembrance that addresses unresolved issues of the past and listens with empathy to the voices of victims. The TRC in South Africa placed truth rather than justice in the first position. It was inspired by the idea of reconciliation and hence by negotiation, compromise, and an orientation towards integration and a new beginning. Today, there are almost 30 TRCs working all over the world where the rules of the procedure have to be reinvented each time according to the specific circumstances. So we don't have a model in the sense that it can be reapplied. It's a model that has to be reinvented all of the time. Their aim is first and foremost a pragmatic one. They are designed as instruments for what I would like to call for mastering the past. The fact that the equivalent German term Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which is often translated as mastering the past, has a very negative ring, is another indicator of the difference between the second and the third model that I'm here proposing. So this is one of the reasons why I really think we're dealing here with two different things. And my way of explaining this is that we should distinguish between Vergangenheitsbewältigung, third model, and Vergangenheitsbewahrung, which would be the second model, preservation of the past as opposed to the mastering of the past. We have learned in the meantime that a new beginning cannot be forged on a tabula rasa, nor is there such a thing as an hour zero. To begin anew requires now not forgetting but remembering, as opposed to what Churchill actually proposed. The road from authoritarian to civil societies leads through the needle's ear of facing, remembering, and coming to terms with a burdened past. The transformation process of memory that starts with TRC commissions on a political level has to be deepened, of course, on the social level, which takes much more time. It's not a process of just transformation. A transition can last for 1 or 2 generations. But however long it may take and how deep it may go, remembering is not the aim of the process, but only its medium. The aim is to facilitate recognition, reconciliation, and eventually forgetting, in the sense of putting a traumatic past behind in order to be able to imagine a common future. With the third model, we have looked at cases in which a state transitions from dictatorship to democracy or confronts a traumatic history in order to create a shared moral consensus within its nation and society. My fourth model applies to situations that transcend such internal reconstructions of nations and societies. It concerns the memory policy of 2 or more states that share a common legacy of traumatic violence. 2 countries engage in a dialogic memory if they face a shared history of mutual violence by mutually acknowledging their own guilt and empathy with the suffering they have inflicted on others. As a rule, national memories are not dialogic but monologic. They are constructed in such a way that they are identity-enhancing and self-celebrating. Their main function is generally to enhance and celebrate a positive collective self-image. National memories are self-serving and therein closely aligned to national myths, which Peter Sloterdijk has appropriately termed as modes of self-hypnosis. With respect to traumatic events, these myths provide effective protection shields against events that a nation prefers to forget. When facing negative events in the past, there are only 3 dignified roles for the national collective to assume. That of the victor who has overcome evil, that of the resistor who has heroically fought evil, and that of the victim who has passively suffered evil. Everything else lies outside the scope of the memory perspectives and is conveniently forgotten. After the Second World War, for instance, with the Germans as in the evident role of the perpetrators, all the other national memories chose one of these dignified positions. The narrative of the victor was that of the Allies. The narrative of the resistor, for instance, was that of the GDR and France. The narrative of the victim was chosen by Poland and Austria. Austria as the first victim of Hitler. After 1989 and the demise of the Soviet Union, the opening of Eastern European archives brought to light a number of documents that challenged some of these clear-cut memory constructs. The Holocaust that had been a peripheral site in the Second World War gradually had come into the center and become its defining event. I showed you, 20 years, 40 years, until 2005, when it really moved into the center. In the light of this shift in historical perspective, new evidence of active collaboration, passive support, and indifference to the crime of the Holocaust brought about a crisis in national memories. In Western Europe, the national constructions of memory have become more complex through the acknowledgement of collaboration. And here I show you just the example of these three groups of victims, former purely victims, victim nations, purely resistor nations, and then also totally neutral nations, which have been sort of unsettled. In many Eastern states, however, the memory of the Holocaust has to compete with the memory of one's own victimhood and suffering under communist oppression, which is a hot memory that emerged only after the end of the Cold War. Because there is a notorious shortage in memory capacity, the atrocities that one has suffered claim more space than the atrocities that one has committed. Another lack of dialogic memory has become manifest in the relations between Russia and Eastern European nations. While Russian memory is centered around the great patriotic war and Stalin is celebrated today as the national hero, the nations that broke away from Soviet power maintain a strikingly different memory of Stalin that has to do with deportations, forced labor, and mass killings. The triumphalist memory of Russia and the traumatic memory of Eastern European nations clash at the borders of Europe and fuel continuous irritations and conflicts. There are dark incidents that are well known to historians and emphatically commemorated by the traumatized country, but that are totally forgotten by the nation that has was immediately responsible for the suffering. And here I give you a couple of examples. While in the meantime, they have learned a lot about the Holocaust, younger Germans today know next to nothing about the legacy of the Second World War and the atrocities committed by Germans against, for instance, their Polish and Russian neighbors. The Warsaw Uprising, a seminal event commemorated in Poland, is unknown to Germans because it is fully eclipsed by the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And this includes even the head of state who visited Poland and was confused about these two events. Roman Herzog, actually the person who introduced the 27th of January now as a transnational European commemoration day. Germans have rightly reclaimed the area bombing of Dresden for their national memory, but they have totally forgotten a key event in Russian memory, namely the Leningrad blockade by the German Wehrmacht, through which 700,000 Russians were starved to death. This event has never entered German national memory due to a lack of interest, empathy, or external pressure. There are promising beginnings between teachers and historians of neighboring countries working on shared textbooks and mutual perceptions. On the whole, however, dialogic memory is still more a project than a reality and is best exemplified by its absence. It must be emphasized, however, that the European Union creates a challenge to the solipsistic constructions of national memory and provides an ideal framework for dialogic remembering. As we all know, the European Union is itself the consequence of a traumatic legacy, of an entangled history of unprecedented violence. If it is to develop further from an economic and political network to a community of shared values, the entangled histories will have to be transformed into mutually shared memories. Janusz Reiter, previous Polish ambassador in Germany, commented on this situation when he said, "With respect to its memories, the European Union remains a split continent. After its expansion, the line that separated the EU from other countries now runs right through it." On the occasion of the 60th anniversary of the liberation of Buchenwald, the former prisoner of the concentration camp, Jorge Semprún, said, "One of the most effective possibilities to forge a common future for the EU is to share our past, our remembrance, our hitherto divided memories." And he added that the eastern extension of the EU can only work, I quote once more, "once we will be able to share our memories, including those of the countries of the other Europe, the Europe that was caught up in Soviet totalitarianism." Already in the 1920s, historian Marc Bloch criticized the monologic character of national memory constructions, describing their solipsistic nature as, I quote him, as a dialogue between the deaf. 80 years after Bloch, the European Union is offering a framework which makes possible and demands the restructuring of monologic into more dialogic memories. Dialogic remembering, which is of course applicable in any region of the world, has a special relevance for Europe. It could produce a new type of nation state that is not exclusively grounded in pride, but also accepts its quantum of guilt, thus, or responsibility, thus ending the destructive history of violence by including the victims of this violence into one's own memory. Such an inclusive memory, which is based on the moral standard of accountability and human rights, can in turn help to back up the protection of human rights and support the values of a civil society. Dialogic remembering links two nations through their common knowledge of a shared legacy of a traumatic past. This, however, does by no means entail a unified master narrative for Europe. Richard Sennett has once remarked that it needs a plurality of contesting memories in order to acknowledge uncomfortable facts. That is exactly the potential that the frame of the EU has to offer, the transforming of solipsistic into more dialogic memories, even though it may take another shift of sensibility before this potential will eventually be embraced by its member states. I come to my conclusion, and I start by quoting another Israeli, this time not Avishai Margalit, but Amos Oz, who once remarked, "If I had a say in the peace talks, no matter where and why, Oslo or wherever, I would instruct the sound technicians to turn off the microphones as soon as one of the negotiating parties starts talking about the past. They are paid for finding solutions for the present and the future." Unfortunately, issues concerning the confronting of the past and the solving of urgent problems for the future are not always so easy to sever. On the contrary, all over the world, acts of remembering are today part and parcel of the project of establishing the foundations of a more just society and a better future. It must be conceded, however, that memories are double-edged and can promote integration as well as disintegration. They are both part of the problem, as Amos Oz reminds us, and of its solution. Whether memories are part of the problem by prolonging inequality and violence, as Christian Meyer insisted, or whether they are a means to transform historical antagonisms and overcome a divisive, violent past, depends purely on the way they are framed in a given political and social configuration. And I give you here a few criteria that one could think of in evaluating or thinking about memory constructs and their possible effects or consequences. Does the afterlife of a specific event make a society more revengeful or more self-consciousness on account of its past? Does it bring out an aggressive potential in the society, or does it render it more dialogic with respect to its neighbors, or does it make the citizens more sensitive or more callous to human rights violations and the situation of their minorities? So when we look back on the history of the 20th century from the vantage point of the present, we discover that our manner and methods of dealing with traumatic pasts have changed a number of times, elaborating different models. The first model, dialogic forgetting, was imposed to achieve the closure of a violent past in a symmetric situation of power. This form of forgetting or silence can only work to create the basis for a new future where the aggression was once not one-sided but mutual. While repressive silence is the automatic form that perpetuates the structure of violence by prolonging oppressive power relations, which protect the perpetrators and harm the victims, dialogic silence is built on a mutual agreement. The second model, remembering in order to never forget, was developed as a unique answer to the singular historic trauma of the Holocaust. The shift from forgetting to remembering, which evolved over over the last 4 decades, has irreversibly changed our moral sensibility on a global scale. While the memory of the Holocaust was conducive to the emergence of other memories, it did not, I would claim, become their prototype. The Holocaust is unique given the methods of its execution and the number of irredeemable and irreconcilable victims. The answer to it is a monumental memory that is semi-religious and an end in itself. The third model, in contrast, is not unique at all, but has been replicated in variations all over the world. It can be paraphrased by remembering in order to overcome, in the sense of mastering the past and putting it behind. I wanted to show that there is a clear difference between the semi-religious memorialization, the second model, and the mastering of the past, which begins with a claim to recognition of past suffering of the victims and to more accountability on behalf of the former perpetrators with respect to atrocities committed in the past in order to move on to processes of political reconciliation and social integration. Not only punishments, but also public displays of remorse, no matter whether they stem from instrumental, rhetorical, or normative motivations, are central elements of collective conflict resolution and reconciliation processes. The last model is again dialogic and relational, this time applied between states, but also possible for groups within one state. Dialogic remembering transforms a traumatic history of violence into an acknowledgement of one's own guilt. On the basis of this shared knowledge, two states can coexist peacefully rather than be exposed to the pressure of periodical eruptions and scandals of renewed violence. For the fourth model, however, there are as yet only few illustrations. It is not yet a reality, but surely an important new possibility within the European framework. Memories, to sum up, are dynamic. What is being remembered of the past is largely dependent on the cultural frames, moral sensibilities, and demands of the ever-changing present. During the Cold War, the memory of the Second World War was very different from today. The Holocaust has moved in the meantime from the periphery to the center of Western European memory only during the last 2 decades. But also other historic traumas went through periods of latency before they became the object of remembering and commemoration. Today, national memories emerge and are presented in a transnational, if not a global arena, where they coexist in a web of mutual contiguities, references, imitations, observations, reactions, and competitions. And that has to do with the media situation. Remembering trauma evolves between the extremes of keeping the wound open on the one hand and looking for closure on the other. We should not forget that it always takes place simultaneously on the separate but interrelated levels of the individuals, families, societies, and the state. It therefore, I think that this is why the project that you are launching tonight is so important, to bring in literature, because literature will focus especially on the role of individuals, families within a society. It therefore has a psychological, a moral, and a political dimension. But there is also a religious dimension when it comes to the proper burying of as a prerequisite for the memory of the dead. It is precisely this cultural and religious duty of laying the dead to rest that is so shockingly disrupted after periods of excessive violence. And we can think here of the Spanish Civil War, which I will come to. In the case of millions of Jewish victims, there are no graves because their bodies were gassed, burnt, and dissolved into air. For this reason, this wound cannot be closed. At other places, the victims were disappeared or shot and hid in anonymous mass graves. Some of these relating to the Spanish War are reopened only now after more than 75 years. While the politicians and the society have still not found a consensus for introducing these victims into a shared memory, it is now up to the individual family members to recover their dead and to perform these last acts of reverence. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for this lecture. I think it was a very telling example for the political dimension of research on memory. So now I want to invite the audience to come forward with questions.
First of all, thank you for your very interesting and I think inspiring lecture. And I wanted to ask you something which relates, you have actually mentioned it a little bit at the end, and that it was striking to me that one of the differences between the third and the fourth model was the one is being applied internally within a state to as a tool to cope with a kind of internal division, whereas the fourth one was only used so far like between the states. And I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on the possibility to use the fourth model, dialogic memory, internally within a state or national culture. And if I extend this a little bit, to ask ourselves if as well this internal dialogue about memory is not a precondition for effective engagement in this international dialogue.
That's a very good point. Thank you very much. No, you're absolutely right. Just talking about European memory, I focused also on 2 states and the border, negotiating memories across the border, which is very important to introduce when we talk about European memory. But you're absolutely right that it has to start internally in a way within the society, and that could make the society and the state more dialogic than also to engage in other forms of dialogue. I give you an example. I said it took so long for in Germany, I confine myself now to German examples, to establish a Holocaust memory, and here we can refer to the memorial in Berlin in 2005. And it was only a few weeks ago that the monument for the Sinti and Roma was dedicated. And it was quite amazing. Well, it took another 7 years, to come up with this next memory. So there is an obvious subterranean memory which is in preparation in a state of latency, and it took so much more time. And in this case, of course, the group had little political power and social prestige, and therefore it had to wait for another 7 years. So the fact that this monument was eventually dedicated made an amazing impact, had an amazing impact, and the person who spoke at the occasion even spoke of he even used the term Akt der Wiedergutmachung. Of course, there is no way of Wiedergutmachung, making whole what has been smashed. It's impossible. But what he meant was that the recognition, the symbolic recognition, is a very, very important gift that is desired ardently and withheld for so long. The longer it is withheld, the deeper the pain grows. So that would be an example for dialogic memory, which in Germany was implemented only very recently. And of course, you're right. It can work in all kinds of contexts, and it also works in other social and political contexts of colonial situation. If you think of the apologies to the indigenous people and on the account of the so-called stolen generations in Australia, that was another example. Or now there is a dialogic memory that is being formed between the British and the Irish, which is extremely important. The IRA and the Queen went to Ireland the first time, I think after a period of 100 years, an English head of state came to Ireland to shake hands. You can argue this is only symbols, but we now know within cultural studies we should not underestimate symbols. And especially for the head of state of a nation like the former British Empire, it takes a lot to perform such acts because they're humbling, and it shows that they are changing their self-image. And this, of course, in addition to material reparations and so forth, is important, but the symbolic act in itself should not be underestimated.
Ich mache das schon. Nein, ich mache schon. Du sollst nur sagen, wer.
You were mainly speaking about the victim's perspective, which I think is logical, how their memories should be preserved. But I was thinking about the other perspective, like the perpetrator's perspective. Do you think that, how well is your system of these four models applied to their memories, and how much do you think that their memories should be preserved?
Well, the point is to integrate the perspective, of course, atrocities and historical events happen always from different perspectives, and in the case of a traumatic clash, you have extremely different perspectives of those who at this situation were omnipotent and those who were totally powerless. And I think it is changing very much the perspective of first of all, the perpetrators. I don't think you can, the biological perpetrators, the persons, you won't be successful to change much about their memories. I'm talking here about the political framework of the nation that succeeds the former. In the case of Germany, after 1945, a new successor nation was created, state was created to take over the responsibility. But in the case of transition, political transition, you have the situation of the perpetrator memory being transformed by adopting or integrating the victim's perspective into this memory. This is what I mean. If it is you don't have any memories of perpetrators. This is why I started with forgetting. They don't start, if you have the memories of perpetrators, you have the continuity of the system, then they are in charge. This is what happened. In Nazi Germany, you have all these monuments to people whom we today consider as perpetrators, assassins and so forth, who assassinated. But the moment you have a change in the political system, the whole thing changes. And then the former perpetrators become very quiet, and they all opt for forgetting and amnesia and amnesty. This is what the memory of perpetrators, how it works. And therefore, to introduce explicitly adopt this kind of memory into the public perspective would exactly create that kind of a change that makes it possible to communicate again with the former victim.
I would like to ask you, I read some years ago a very intriguing book by Friedrich Herr, Die Begegnungen der Feinde, and it was written just after the Second World War. And actually, it was very close to your first model, and it was written on a Catholic Christian background, but not as a religious book, maybe more a philosophic one. And I actually wanted about the importance of a dialogical remembering of the past with enemies, with victims. And I wanted to ask you, were there any other such interesting, maybe similar concepts, maybe also in Germany, that were then replaced in the years later, after the war, in the context of the Cold War, by more monological concepts of past?
I'm not quite sure whether I really got what you said. I fear I don't know the book by Friedrich Herr. And you're asking for another example, how dialogic memory already worked back then in the early stage?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, we could give an example of Aktion Sühnezeichen. This was not a political thing at all. It was a kind of civic network, a kind of NGO institution that employed young people of the next generation in order to send them to countries that had most suffered from German oppression and aggression. And it was a kind of volunteering thing to go into these countries. And I must say I always admired these young people for their courage, to go to these places and work there. And this, amazingly, it started in the 50s and 60s. And it is still going on. It has not dwindled at all. There are still people going, young people going, and it is now called no longer Sühnezeichen, which had a heavily religious connotation. It was also came from Protestant background, and now it is transformed into Sühnezeichen Friedensdienste, peace action, and. This has developed into something that is, in a way, exemplary, because this younger generation is really networking on a genuinely European level, creating exchanges and interaction in areas where very little transnational contact is ever had. If you go, for instance, to old people's homes or very rural areas, they build up things here and there. So they carry this idea into regions that usually are not benefited, not the big cities and so forth. And therefore, they are actually engaged in such a peacemaking network on a very personal level, very confined, very personal.
Thank you. I just want to turn back to the question of my colleague here about the point 4, the dialogue. Remembering, does it mean the dialogue is possible just if one finds a voice representing all the victims? Because you said it's not possible to speak with the victims themselves, and I think it's not possible as well because the victims and the aggressors often the situation of the power, domination, and subalternity or something like this. So, in my opinion, it's not possible to speak one with the others.
Okay. I see what you mean, and therefore perhaps I should make this dialogic model a bit more clear, because otherwise it seems rather undoable. Because a confrontation, reconfrontation, and speaking of that could really do a lot of harm, re-traumatize and refuel the strife. No, I'm thinking of something different. I'm thinking only of something actually really simple. And let me come back again to the German example. I'm only speaking here of a memory, not of incidents altogether. There are so many terrible incidents. We cannot unpack them all, dig them up, and just be totally overwhelmed with all the terrible things that Germans did in the Second World War. But I'm here only addressing the absolutely neuralgic, the traumatic points in the memories of European neighbors, in which the Germans took a vital part in which they were responsible for. And so what has happened is now an extremely asymmetric memory. You have a very strong memory on the side of those who were wronged or suffered, and you have a total lack of memory on the side of those who were actually responsible. Now, the young Germans, of course, they are no longer responsible. Why should you burden them with this memory? You could argue, why carry it on to the next generation? Terrible. But if you, as a German, go to these countries and have no idea about this history, you will run into serious difficulties. You will immediately, because it is there in the inhabitants in the second and third generation. And the Germans who travel have no idea. They are totally have no idea. So I think what we need in terms of getting along in Europe, it is just one way, is to learn more about the really decisive incidents, traumatic incidents that are really continuously presenting a continuous wound, and that are also commemorated and so on. Let me give you one example, which is very concrete, and it has nothing to do with the Second World War, and that is my own city where I come from. I come from Constance University. Wonderful. It was founded in 1966. But the city of Constance is another history. Has another history. It is a medieval history, and in the year of 1415, it held a huge concilium, and it invited Johann Hus, to whom it was promised that he would have a safe journey and a safe hearing. But he didn't, as you know. I don't have to tell you the story. He didn't get it. He was burned at stake, and he was really all his remains, everything was that related to this history, and also Hieronimo of Prague, they were really effaced. The remnants were effaced in order to also destroy the memory. They wanted to just forget it. And the city managed to forget this history for 450 years. Of course, all those Protestants who knew the history very well, they came to Constance, they flocked to the city, they established their informal memory there. They were really pilgrimages to Constance. There was quite a continuity of these commemorations going on. But the city of Constance took 450 years, and only in the late 19th century they eventually brought up this monument, which they placed outside of the central city. You know, it's very difficult to find. And whenever you go there, you only find people from the Czech Republic engaged with it. You know, there are always flowers there, but you only hear Czech, you know. And for a tourist, you don't find anything. You go into the center of the city, and on the ground you find these plaques about the Concile and 1415, and it's a moment of pride. And if you go into the internet of Constance and you find at this concile it was possible to prevent a schisma. Wonderful, you prevented a schisma. You don't hear anything about Johann Hus. And when the day comes, the 6th of July, nobody in Constance has any idea about this, you know, what it means. Of course, the mayor then, and maybe 3 or 4 people of the city, then they go, but you have, again, groups from various cities. And, of course, we also have a partner city there who send their groups. But it is a very one-sided affair, this is what I wanted to say. And it is this typical kind of asymmetric memory. You know, it sort of pollutes the self-image. Therefore, we prefer not to talk about it. Now, Constance is about to celebrate this anniversary. It's now the 600 years anniversary coming up, and everybody's already preparing already since 2 years. They are already starting with this. It's going to be a huge event. It's supposed to last for 4 years. It's megalomanic. I don't really have idea what they're all going to do with this event, but they hope, you know, this is a very tiny city, very marginal on the border of Germany. Now it has its great chance to come out on a huge level, no, global, worldwide level to celebrate itself. So it will be problematic, I would argue, because they haven't figured out yet, I think, how they introduce Johann Hus into their celebrations. But that would be one of the things that I found very important. So I have myself collaboration with Prague colleagues, which I started in 1994 already, now for 18 years. And going on, and of course, I'm so indebted to them because they taught me all of this. You know, they didn't explicitly teach me only, but of course, they made me interested and learn about it. So that is actually how a dialogical memory can start, by becoming interested in the other and the history, and therefore also integrate it into your own history. Maybe this is a better example.
Another question.
Thank you. Maybe I would ask let's make a recent question, neo-Nazism. I mean, how do you deal with that? I mean, we were the victims. Now we are making a self-image of us as the perpetrators. I mean, it doesn't really make sense. You see what I mean? I mean, there are guys walking on the street in here, hailing and saying Adolf Hitler. He was killing us. We have been the victims. But, I mean, did we forget so much? Or, I mean, what is this? I mean, we are voting for communists. Yeah, we should resent them. We should say that they did something wrong for our country. But they are getting elected. I mean, it's coming all back. I mean, what is this? I mean, is it any of those 4 levels? Or how would you actually explain it? Because, I mean, somehow it doesn't make sense. But still there.
You're so right. It doesn't make sense, but it is all over the place. It is there. We have to address it. Now, the neo-Nazi phenomenon in Germany has to do with a way of voluntarily polluting the German self-image. Yeah? They don't want to go along. They want to, in a way, because they hate the state, they want to put their emblem, their badge on it, and they know the worst thing they can do to the German self-image is to bring out this this side, as though this were a real trend in the society, and they are now always, showing we are still here and nothing has changed, because in a way this is still the German hetero stereotype in many countries. They always think it's still the same thing, and some are very afraid of Germans. And then when Angela Merkel goes to Athens, because she is represented as a Hitler, with the emblem. So this is, of course, there is something in the I would call it has nothing to do with knowledge and history lessons and all of that. It has to do with the popular imagology, the images that circulate, and also with repressed images. And if you bring up repressed images, you can make a mark, you can become very important. Everybody talks about you. You are in the center. And right now in Germany, of course, we're very concerned because what happened over the last more years was that there were a number of murders which were directed mainly towards immigrants, and they were not thoroughly persecuted, or even the whole search for the culprits did not take the right steps. Things were overlooked. It was dealt with in a very negligent way. And so the saying was, the state was, and the police was blind on this eye, because they, in a way, are hesitant to persecute. They rather blame immigrants than the neo-Nazis. So this has created huge controversy and upheaval in the state, and we are now, right now, talking a lot in Germany about this problem, how to come to terms with that neglect or this rather lenient mode of procedure. So I would argue there are problems in the society, but I would also like to say that the society is very active and vigilant. Once it comes to the fore, everybody talks about it, and things are written, and there is a discourse, and there is a lot of writing done in the media. So at least it's not covered up. That is always the good sign about it. Of course, what is uncovered is very disastrous, but at least it is covered up. It is uncovered. It is uncovered, what I want to say. And you say there is a new revaluing of communism right now at the same time.
Yeah. Basically, both of these movements are in here, in Czech Republic and in Slovakia. Yeah, so basically I said, for Nazism, we have been the victims, but there are still groups in here who actually hail this group. And communism, the same thing.
Well, there is a difference, of course, here, because neo-Nazis, even though the NPD party cannot be fully forbidden, even though whenever there's a demonstration, we have 10 counter-demonstrations, so there is a sort of civic vigilance to contain them. And they don't have, I would argue, a strong possibility of mobilizing, many voters, or they remain below, the relevant spectrum. I don't know about this new development with the Communist Party here, and the question is, of course, I would like to see, if the Communist Party comes back, that within the Communist Party there should be some kind of transitional process. Transitional process means just the opposite of what is happening in Russia, that they tell their story, that they show that they know the story. If they know the story, then we don't have to be afraid. I mean, this is why remembering and recognition and also giving the due to the victims is so important, symbolically important, because it shows that they know what has happened and that will not repeat it, or they are aware and therefore they will take another course. So why should a party not be transformed? But it would have to show public signs of transformation, which have to do with the remembering of the story that has happened, and not with the effacing of it.
Well, I would like to just slightly disagree with my colleague here, because he said that communism is somehow in the Czech Republic now publicly acknowledged. I'd say the opposite is true, that on the political level and in the media, the communists are rather excluded. There are also institutes, one of them is Institute for the Study of the Totalitarian Regimes, which actually pushes forward certain visions of history, which are obviously, in a way, a tool of the state to promote certain vision of the history. And so on the public level, I'd say that rather communists are excluded and their narratives are excluded, but yet still the people do vote for them at this moment, which is kind of paradoxical. So my question is to you, we always deal with certain uses of the past, using of the past, and every regime is using the past, their vision of the past, which also is not just a symptom of totalitarian regimes, but it's also a symptom of liberal regimes, as we can see that in the whole Eastern Europe, especially after 2000, which some authors would say that it's some kind of radicalization of the historical politics. So how do you include this kind of aspect of power and state power, which actually is using the certain visions of the past?
Thank you very much. No, it's very, very important. Every political regime uses the past and selects bits and pieces and omits other pieces. Of course, memory does not give much space, so there is very little space in memory, and it's very important what you put into it and what you leave out. So it has, number one, it has to be selective. That is clear. A history book can contain many things, but memory has to condense it all. And whatever is selected is used to define the self-image, of course. That's what it is built on. Now, about the selectivity in itself is no problem. All memories are selective. But if the selectivity is manifestly exclusive, that everybody knows what is excluded, it becomes more difficult. And I would argue here that the concept of Stalin being split into two halves and the triumphant victor is included, and the other part of Stalin, dark side, is totally vanished and has disappeared. That creates a situation that makes it very difficult for those who actually suffered in the time, because that part of history is erased, in a way. But it has disappeared, and it is even negated, or it's not just forgotten, it is even negated. So the point is to how inclusive do you make that national memory on which the self-image is based, in order to be able to make it dialogic and to live in coexistence with your neighbors. That is, again, the question that I'm posing here. And you are thinking along these lines as well, as I can see.
So is it finally possible to say that, as well as the voices of the both sides of dialogue, we are inventing such as models of memories, two models of memories who are in dialogue? That's it?
I'm not quite sure whether I understood. Just
you
say it again.
You said the memory is exclusive. That we remember just certain things, and from the things
I said it
we
is
remember,
selective.
We are composing our memory.
Yeah. I just made a distinction between selective, every memory is selective, and I spoke of exclusive. Of course, selection means also exclusion, but I really meant the difference that it's exclusion, we can speak of exclusion if something is omitted and missing, that everybody knows it is omitted. In the case of selection, we don't talk about what is all left out, because it doesn't matter or is not relevant. But in this case, we are dealing with something that is highly relevant, and therefore something that is omitted. And that is what I would like to call exclusion. And in the case of exclusion, we always have possible correctives. We can think in a democracy, you have historians, they write books, and they can publish it, and then they can disseminate the knowledge and people can learn. You have also individuals who have experienced things, they can also talk about this, they can also create a discourse, and you can put this history back into a kind of public space. And of course, if you have a plaque or monument or something that acknowledges that something happened, then most of the people are, satisfied, because it means a recognition of what they went through and suffered. But if nothing of the sort appears, like in the city of Moscow and in the other public spaces, there are no signs or of commemoration of this event. It is like a withholding of this fact from the public. It's a form of erasure, and it is the opposite of an acknowledgement, which is in a way waited for. The problem, I'm always told by Russians, is in Russia it's impossible to do it otherwise. Because in Russia there were periods in which the atrocities connected with the name of Stalin were publicly addressed and already discussed, but now they are in such a situation that they argue, well, everybody was involved. So how could we address anything in which everybody is a victim and a perpetrator at the same time? It's a much too complicated story. We cannot tell this story. It doesn't have a narrative, it doesn't have a message, doesn't have a meaning, so we better forget it. That's more or less what I hear. But I would argue that the people who have created this memorial archive, for instance, who are now collecting all the remnants of those people who have dedicated it to them, they could at least get some public acknowledgement, which is clearly withheld from them. So nothing in terms of symbols. It's absolutely covered up from that perspective, and this, I think, creates also an emphasis or pressure on those states who suffered, because their museums are full with the atrocities, and you have this silence on the other side. That is a huge asymmetry, and also there is something missing from our knowledge of communism and history of communism. As long as we cannot tell this story in a non-transnational way, we cannot place it back into the map of Europe. And therefore, I also think that while the Holocaust has been established as a transnational memory of Europe, absolutely also the crimes of Stalin should also be reintegrated into that complex, and I don't see any reason why these different experiences cannot be combined within a shared European memory.
Because, for our generation, I'm born in the 70s.
70s, yes.
70s. We are not very fond of believing to the memory, because for us, the words you mentioned, like Hitler and Stalin and Stalingrad and Second World War and so on, they are blends, such as blends, not stories, if you understand. In school, when I was little, I wasn't taught to the stories. I wasn't taught to understand the stories, but just to take the blends. And when I was older, I had to stop to believe those blends and change them on the opposite side. So now people such old as I am are a bit confused. Who was the victim?
Okay.
Who was the hero? Which story and which memory is the right?
Okay.
Sorry for my English.
Yeah, no, thank you. You made yourself perfectly clear. That is a problem. Memory, the truth and the basis and the foundation of memory. Memory can be wholly ideologized, and we spoke, it is a tool for politics, and therefore we have to look at criteria. And one of the first criteria, of course, has it happened? Yeah. Is it confirmed by evidence? Who tells the story, and what is the credibility of the story? You know, stories are told from different perspectives. Fortunately, within Europe and our cultures, we are here in the building of the Academy of Sciences, and usually you have historians, you know, who work in, of course, in totalitarian regimes. The historians are the handmaids of the state. They always fabricate the story that the state needs to rely on. But the point is that in democracies, we have at least a belief in the possibility that scholarship works in a different way, because it is corrected, you know, by other scholars. It's not owned by the nation. History is never owned by a nation. So other historians can step in, and there should be archives, and there should be some evidence about which story, you know, is a background and a basis. When I speak about memory, I don't speak about fabulations and making up this story or that story, whatever fits the current regime. It has, of course, to be based on historical experience that is also documented. Only in those cases where you don't have documents, which of course also happens, like in colonial situations and indigenous situations, slavery, there are a couple of cases where, and also Armenian genocide, or also the Gulag, you don't have many sources and perhaps no access to these sources. In these cases, it's the poets and the artists who take over the responsibility to write the story, and Solzhenitsyn to write a book, which then does the work of the historians. But this is the exception. Usually we rely on historical evidence and the story of the accounts of the historians. And sometimes they have to be complemented also by literature and other means and media. But without historians, we cannot move anywhere within the memory discourse, because that would be giving it all away to the politicians and their short-lived, perspectives and aims to consolidate power.
So the chance for one more question before we close the discussion. No question. That means that we close the discussion already. Thank you very much again for this inspiring talk. Thank you to you all for coming.
And just one last word. This is the end of Prague Readings 2012. And we look forward to 2013. But at the beginning of a new series, your series. Do you want to say to some dates?
I already used it. So you have the program of this literary Studies Forum at the Institute of Czech Literature. In your handout, it is for the winter term, and the summer term we will have as well very interesting talks. And at the end, we will have a round table with three writers, with Radka Denemarková, Josef Haslinger from Germany, and Oksana Zabushko from Ukraine. So, thank you once again.
Once again.